we go to mid of January. That's when Ukrainian government introduced what is known as dictatorship laws that were enacted by parliament and signed eventually by Yanukovych very quickly on January 16. And after those laws were signed, the protests intensified. Again, backfired was in place very quickly, and we saw that. However, that time after that protest came out, and the nonviolent discipline broke down, and that violence, represented partial breakdown of that discipline. During ensuing violence, as Lena mentioned earlier, 3 protesters were killed, and in concession to the protesters, Yanukovych repelled the controversial laws and dismissed even his prime minister. And then an uneasy truce between the opposition and the government took hold, while the negotiations about the release of arrested activists continued between the regime and the opposition. And this is a question for Natalia and Dimitro. I would like to ask you to explain to us the reasons for the breakdown of nonviolent discipline among the protesters in Kiev. What accounted for the rise of a violent minority within the Maidan movement? If you can say a few things about who are those people, how large was the number in comparison with the size of the protest, and how they were perceived by the activists and population in general. So, Natalia, if you can start, explaining to us the kind of the violent flank within the movement, and then maybe Dimitro could contribute as well.
It's a complex and, of course, a controversial issue in a way, because it definitely was not the majority, yes, and there was this point, just to give, it's absolutely necessary to give a context, because there was this idea that the protests are dying out, and these laws which mentioned played a huge role as well, because those laws actually forbade everything, like everything. So it was equally, I would be equally for instance, a criminal, or I should be sentenced for 15 of deaths for post in Facebook, or for throwing a Molotov cocktail, which has never happened before in Ukraine. The borderline was crossed. Everything a person will do would be illegal. So in the mindset of people, it's actually really changed their idea about the violence, because before violence wouldn't be tolerated. The other thing, at that moment, the people expected something from the leaders of the position, and it was not something new. It was already a couple of months, and they came and basically told nothing. Like there was no plan. And there was a lot of already energy which people want to put somewhere, because it was another decisive moment, because it was official dictatorship after those laws. So there was a tiny group of people who decided that we would go and block the one of the barricades, not the barricades, but when the police was standing, which actually wouldn't be any sense to do that, because there would be an empty parliament building behind. But that was also, we also don't know till now whether the agent provocateurs, whether provocators among there. But if before there was a case, they were definitely there. It's true that it was not just supported, like there was a small number of people who initiated. I won't tell the violence, but I would tell like Molotov cocktails, for instance, yes? And just remind it, this is something which would be okay in France, in Greece, the society absolutely have no troubles with that, because they seen Molotov cocktails bunch times of their life, and it's not something which, like it's not the end of the regime. But in Ukraine, somehow the level of tolerance, the knowledge of the violence, knowledge of the nature of violence in society was so low that even throwing Molotov cocktails was something incredible. It was like breaking a huge, like crossing a super red line. The red line was so, and this was like on the psychological level. So there were kind of a group of people at that moment, but a lot of people, in a way that they regretted that. And I would say that for about a week, maybe a bit more, there was this, for instance, now it's a very famous group all over the world, the right sector. We know that there were up to 100 of them in December. And if you talk the mass protest, 800,000 people coming to the streets before, and maybe even more in the region. So how much would they would present in the general mass movement? But unfortunately, I should tell that, and their impact compared to the civil sector of Maidan, compared to the work of, for instance, of independent media, compared to the work of the doctors, volunteers, was such a small, but in a way it was the loudest. So, for instance, for the 1 week of the very strong emotions, of the week when the country the first time experienced the death, they were on the spot, and they were the loudest. So somehow the discourse changed, and the people thought that they were the one who were important. But I should also tell, it takes a bit of time for society which has no knowledge about a previous violence, very easily is over emotional about that. And but it takes a bit of time, and what I would tell them, the disappointment of the radicals, or like this kind of there is no anymore image of heroization of them, you know. It lasted not long. It was powerful for a couple of weeks probably, and then later it declined in Ukraine as this, not talking about the Russian media or how it's portrayed later. So I think the reason behind that was, but also to giving the message before, I should tell it could be much worse, because there is such a group as self-defense, and I talked to the head of the self-defense right after, and what he told, that actually they practice a lot of, when you have a lot of guys, a lot of people, a lot of men who are constantly present at Maidan and should protect, kind of, they have this feeling, they have not the ammunition, but for instance kind of the masks, the uniform and something like that, they feel they are urged to do something. So the self-defense actually was doing a lot to waste this energy for something, to do physical training, to cut the woods, to do anything else, because there were people behind who really understood the danger of this, incredible amount of people, because the basic reason was the state was provoking. There were people who wanted to provoke. There was no knowledge. But also, nobody proposed any really effective or clear strategy, a long-term strategy. Said, okay, if you want to, because there were talks like, if the people want to tell they are strong, why are they not coming and not becoming the bodyguards of those like people who are under threat? There was always a job to do, but I guess the lack of this creativity also, creativity in how to use this force, and already the population which is very desperate, where to move them, where to forward them.
Thanks, Natalia. Dimitra, would you like to add anything on this topic of the breakdown of nonviolent discipline and those groups that led violence?
Yeah, actually, but before doing that, I would just mention that in the recent Ukrainian history there was a case of Molotov cocktails, and that was prior to the Orange Revolution. And actually, this is probably one of the explanations why the Orange Revolution was nonviolent on the part of the movement. In May 9, 2001, there was Molotov cocktail at the Bankova Street in front of the presidential administration. Yeah. And as a result, the movement was cracked down, and dozens of people got arrested and spent several years in jail. So there was that experience, and it testified to the fact that it was a wrong idea. And actually, of course, at that point, people also were asking whether those were provocators or just stupid activists. And in the end, it makes no difference, because in the end, the regime is just getting legitimacy to crack down on the movement. But coming back to the to Maidan, Euromaidan now, the day violence on this part of the movement occurred, I also asked myself that question, and I went out to Grushevskovo Street, and I saw these people who were doing that. And first of all, I saw just, babushkas, grandmother, who were delivering Molotov cocktails, and I'm not sure whether they were activists of the right sector NGO or group, or or some other organization. I did not have time to ask them because they were moving so fast and they were delivering this Molotov cocktails so energetically to the barricades. It's just to describe how all that worked. You know, you did not have to be any activist of any group of organization. You just had to have willingness to go there and to express your feelings towards the regime, as if those people in uniforms, they are the key people in the regime, and you could get that opportunity just within 5 minutes when you're on the stage. And so that's I guess what I can tell about this.
And how did it in terms of to visualize that? So there were a couple of hundreds, you know, throwing Molotov cocktails, and then tens of thousands staying in the Maidan, somewhere else doing some other things.
Yeah. Majority of Ukrainians naturally did not want to participate in violence. Lots of people were not happy to hear another day of statements from the stage that the protest is peaceful, etc., etc. And that's partially responsibility of the organizers of the movement, not the statements of the peaceful protest, but the fact that there was no action. Okay, the people saw no solution to that withstanding. They could see no way out of that withstanding. Okay, so naturally in this situation, those calling for more radical actions, they not just prevailed, they just started doing that. And physically, the leaders, the political leaders of the opposition, they were trying to stop that violence, okay? But some activists, they called for active solution, and they were calling for taking over the parliament from the stage, okay? And that was the day the violence on the part of the movement started.